What happens when a woman is given the IP to a beloved franchise? In Tillie Walden's case, nothing good. Comic scholarship has spent a lot of time on the formal side of things. McLeod mapping out closure in the gutter, that whole tradition. But Chute's Graphic Woman and Hélène Cixous's push back on that, asking whose bodies are actually showing up on the page and who gets to draw them. This essay is an analysis of the ways in which Tillie Walden and her involvement in the Clementine comics were received by the public. I'm specifically looking at not just the ways Walden is critiqued and judged because people do not like her version of the events, but also how they perceived the way a woman ruined Clementine. To backtrack a little, I want to discuss my qualifications on talking about The Walking Dead. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, my best friend introduced me to The Walking Dead. We sat and watched the first few episodes on her big flat-screen TV, and to say I immediately fell in love was an understatement. I went home with a borrowed DVD set and sat and watched the entirety of seasons 1 and 2. Because, not to age myself here, but when I first started watching, season 3 had only just started airing. Something about the gritty, grayish tones of the episodes, combined with the graphic depictions of zombies, surpassed any experience I had with zombie media in the past. I had watched Night of the Living Dead, 1968, in my godmother's living room when I visited her in France the year prior. The black and white nature of the movie, while still scary to a child, somehow made it more digestible. So, when I was introduced to The Walking Dead, I made it my mission to consume as much material as I possibly could, which included reading the first Wikipedia of the comic, and then I played the Telltale games as they were released, and thought of myself as something as a superfan, or as much of a superfan as a 13-year-old girl could be. To say that I grew up with The Walking Dead would be an understatement. The whole franchise colored my adolescence and shaped me to be the woman I am today. Someone who is really into zombie movies and a really good comic book. The Walking Dead was created in 2003 by author Robert Kirkman and illustrator Tony Moore. This was just after the success of his other comic series, Invincible, which followed the story of a teenage superhero. To note, I actually also really like Invincible and think that if you have the time, watching the show on Amazon Prime is a great use of it. Kirkman, inspired by other zombie media, such as the Living Dead series and Resident Evil, thought he could write a potential successor to Night of the Living Dead, though it is important to note that he does not state whether or not this was meant to be the 1968 version or the 1990 version. He was initially turned away by Image Comics and was only given the chance to publish after he lied about the plot. To avoid publisher radar, he stated that the apocalypse and The Walking Dead would result from an alien invasion and followed the survivors from there. However, once he secured the book deal, he disclosed to the publisher that he had actually lied and there were no aliens. On another note, we actually have no idea what caused the outbreak of the zombie virus in the Walking Dead universe. This is something that has never been revealed. Somehow, he didn't get let go or punished. Instead, they gave him the go-ahead, and he started to work on the comic he really wanted to create. The comic series was an instant success, and in 2010, Kirkman and the new illustrator, Charlie Adlard, won the Eisner Award for Best Continuing Series. Then, on Halloween of 2010, the first episode of the show aired on AMC. The world of The Walking Dead absolutely exploded. People like me, who had seen the show, started flocking to the comic book stores to get the newest issue for sneak peeks at what might happen next. By season 2, the show had already made some major diversions from the comic books, but overall, the hype around them stayed strong. On April 24th of 2012, the first episode of Telltale's The Walking Dead was released. Telltale, as a game company, had produced a few choose-your-own-adventure type games before the release of The Walking Dead, but the format had become a revolutionary way to tell the story of survival. Not only were you watching it, but you were a part of it. In the first season, you take control of Lee, a former professor who, much like Rick Grimes, woke up in the apocalypse. However, in succeeding seasons, the main player character is young teen Clementine. She's a very young child at the start of the first game, but over the course of 4 seasons, the player watches her grow into the type of survivor only Rick Grimes himself could parallel. Clementine had become a very beloved part of the Walking Dead IP. Her story of survival and growth had really touched a huge part of the fandom, and even at the game's worst, Season 3's A New Frontier being the most widely disliked, she was still an awesome character. As a bit of short summary before I get into the next part of the essay, Clementine's story seemingly ended in 2018 with the release of the final season and episodes of the Telltale games. After a long, hard battle against a rival group of survivors, Clementine is bitten by a walker and seemingly begins to turn. However, due to her companion AJ's quick thinking, her leg is amputated and her life is saved. A time skip shows that Clem and AJ have made Erickson Academy their home and plan to stay there for as long as they can. 2021, Skybound Comics announced that a short 12-page comic based on the Telltale Games character Clementine would be released in July of that year. This followed the inception of a new line of comics, Skybound X. Each issue would include a small teaser for other comic stories that may or may not be picked up for further publication. The comic based on Telltale's Clementine would be called Clementine Lives, and gave readers a little insight as to what Clementine and her companion AJ were up to after the events of the final episode of the game. This short comic was written and illustrated by American Eisner Award-winning Tillie Walden. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this essay, I'd like to introduce Tillie Walden. She's a 30-year-old graphic novelist who gained a significant amount of popularity after the publication of her figure skating memoir, Spinning, in 2017. In 2018, she won an Eisner Award for Best Reality-Based Work. She currently lives and works in Vermont as an illustrator and instructor at the Center for Cartoon Studies. It is important to note two things. First, that Walden identifies as a queer woman. She has a wife and son. And second, that Walden has long hair and glasses. I promise this is relevant later. Looking at credentials and the fact that The Walking Dead author Robert Kirkman is also an Eisner Award-winning writer, Walden would be more than qualified to produce the Clementine comics. Unfortunately, the fandom does not feel that this is the case. The short Clementine Lives comic was a teaser for an eventual publication of a trilogy that follows Clementine post-season 4, episode 4. Each installment of the series would see Clementine in a different geographical location up against different villains. This book series would be fully illustrated in graphic novel format, much like the original comic run. Tillie Walden, who wrote and illustrated this teaser, was also revealed to be the author in charge of this undertaking. In June of 2022, the first book, Clementine 1, was published and available for public purchase. While the Clementine Lives comic had been released to much criticism, the publication of the first full novel was truly the beginning of the end for Walden. Having been passed the torch to one of the most beloved American IPs was the mark of the start of a social takedown that not only impacted Walden herself, but an entire fandom. After Skybound Comics released Clementine Lives, the general consensus was bad. Popular comic commentator Dom the Bomb published a video on July 13, 2021, only days after the comic had been published, titled The Walking Dead, Clementine Review, How to Ruin a Character in 12 Pages. In this video, he outlines every issue he has with the comic and the ways that it portrays Clementine's characterization. He focuses on Clementine leaving the school and on AJ, the young boy she has raised since he was an infant, because she no longer felt as though she fit into the fabric of the school. While it can be justified that this leap from Clementine's original behavior constitutes a major change in characterization, and the dislike of that is normal to some extent, the conversation around it veers heavily into misogyny. Don the Bomb states, Lee would never abandon Clementine. Kenny would never abandon Clementine. Now, you could say all the stuff that happened, but Kenny did what he did in season 2 at the end to basically give Clementine a home. He was willing to sacrifice his own potential spot in Wellington for it. Jane, even if you pick Jane, you know she wanted to be with Clementine. Obviously, stuff happened with that, but this seems more like a Jane Clementine mixed in, a scumbag Clementine, one that doesn't really care about the feelings of others. If you were to look at the Walking Dead fandom, back then and now, you'd find it saturated with male viewership. While women and girls, like me, still enjoy and interact with the media, a lot of commentary and readership lies within the male hemisphere of the internet. But what is the issue with that? How is a predominantly male gaze a problem with the fandom? Well, it's not. There are many different fandoms and groups that typically cater towards male audiences, as well as there are ones that cater towards female audiences. Jujutsu Kaisen is definitely more man-focused than, say, Sailor Moon. However, it does become an issue when a woman creator is brought onto an already existing IP that the male audience deems close to perfect. I found at least 5 videos by various creators that discuss the comic trilogy not just from a literary standpoint, but from the perspective that spends the majority of the time critiquing the artist, Tillie Walden. It's not hard to find what people hated about the Clementine comic. In fact, I just typed Clementine comic review into YouTube and was shown multiple videos of people absolutely trashing the comic and the author. Videos titled, She Butchered the Walking Dead. The Clementine Walking Dead comic is garbage. How to Ruin a Classic Character in 12 Pages. And The Walking Dead, Why the Clementine Books Are Destined to Fail. In this section, I'm going to go over as many of the issues with the comic that people had and explain why I think some of these issues are only issues because Tillie Walden is not a man. The first and main complaint is that Clementine does not behave the way that she does in the comics as she does in the game. In Clementine Lives, there's a conversation that occurs between AJ and Clementine about how she is no longer happy at Erickson and she wants to leave to find herself and her place in the world. This is an emotionally charged interaction as AJ insists he go with her, but is repeatedly told no. And eventually he relents and allows Clementine to leave. This is the main point of argument that people use when discussing the ways in which Walden changed the character. Dom the Bomb saying, throwing away her story and bringing her to a new one that doesn't make much sense. They believe that Clementine leaving the place that she fought to save and the boy she raised is not something she would ever do. But characters change and grow. This is something that is seen in Kirkman's own comic. In issue number 1, Rick Grimes would never think of leaving other people for dead if it meant his own survival. But in the prison arc, he straight up plans to escape without anyone other than his wife and kids, leaving them at the mercy of the governor. His plan obviously fails when they are ambushed and Laurie is killed. Rick's character starts doing things that the reader may view as not in character for him, but no one questioned Kirkman about it because they recognize that characters need to change and grow for them to be realistic. Maybe at the end of the season 4 of the game, Clementine would not have left AJ, but this Clementine is. She's changed and it's not Tillie Walden's fault. How is someone supposed to write the continuation of a character's story without making some changes to the character? Breaking My Heart Telltale on Tumblr says, I believe she tried her best to create a good story for this trilogy, but it's weighed down by the fact that the main character had to be Clementine. Writing an already existing character's IP can be difficult, as people typically look and expect things from that character, but in reality, characters have to grow and change as you write them, or else the book wouldn't be interesting. The other big issue I've seen across the fandom is with Walden's art style. She is best known for expressive and colorful graphics. The use of soft, rounded shapes and thin, smooth line work is a hallmark of Walden's graphic illustrations. Looking at Spinning, it is clear to see why she won an Eisner and why Robert Kirkman chose her to write Clementine. Kirkman himself stated, Tillie Walden is the future. Her boldly authentic voice brings new heights to the world of The Walking Dead, and I couldn't be more proud of what she's doing with the series. But to the majority of the fandom, her illustrations were juvenile and lacked depth in the original comic. One YouTuber placed stills from both comics side by side and stated, to say that Clementine can stand next to The Walking Dead in any capacity is completely asinine. There's heavy critique on her use of black and white imaging, stating that it got too confusing to look at. However, Comiskey Projects believes that the original Walking Dead series comics' reliance on black and white media is what makes it appear timeless and is vital to its storytelling. He explains when the first issue was republished into color, it lost a lot of its gritty and compelling qualities. Using the white space allows the reader to fill in the gaps themselves. This leads me to ask myself, why are the original comics and the Clementine comics viewed so differently? When looking at the comics side by side, their composition is nearly identical. Both use traditional comic structure. This means that panels are read sequentially across the page from left to right and top to bottom. The panels are fairly uniform in size, varying only slightly, but overall there's a high degree of unity. The images do not bleed into the gutter, and the ones that do so are portrayed as large one-page spreads. Both comics, as stated above, are drawn entirely in black and white. The use of color is on the front covers of the issues. The only real difference between the two books is the art style. I am also noting that Robert Kirkman does not draw the comics. For the first few issues, Tony Moore illustrated the comic, and after that, Charlie Adler took on the mantle until the series ends. So why do people hate it? I think they just hate the fact that Clementine's story is being continued and being written by a woman. The art style in Clementine is distinctly feminine. The line work is softer and more informed by a woman's experience. You can tell just by looking at them which is illustrated by a man and which by a woman. The central focus on scenes and where the eye takes you on the page is so different. A woman's gaze is clearly what informs the art style of the Clementine comics, which makes sense, because Clementine is a woman, a queer woman to top that off. Her perspective would be uniquely feminine and feminist because she is feminine and feminist. Feminist comic scholar Hilary Shue believes that the graphic narrative medium is uniquely feminist. The visuals allow women to tell complex political stories by representing the body, memory, and trauma. Tillie Walden engages with elements of this and shifts the story from one of a male perspective to one that holds a candle to the female experience. Clementine is traumatized, highly aware of her body, and in a world that historically has been dominated by the men in her life. First it was Lee, then it was Kenny, then Javi, and finally AJ. She spends so much of her time focusing on taking care of or reacting to the whims of the men in her life that Tilly Walden's exploration of it outside the bounds of these relationships becomes a vital part to Clementine's story. While for readers it might be confusing to see Clementine leave the school after everything, if we look at the way that Chute examines feminist comics, it becomes glaringly obvious that Walden was writing Clementine this way as a means to discuss trauma and the ways that women are typically forced to experience it in ways that make sense to people. Nothing about trauma makes sense, though. Chute discusses the risk of representation, stating, "The complex visual undertaking suggests that we need to rethink the dominant tropes of unspeakability, invisibility, and inaudibility that have tended to characterize trauma theory as well as our current censorship-driven culture in general." This idea is exemplified by netizens' reactions to Walden's interpretation of Clementine and her trauma. They are upset that Walden viewed the American, especially Southern, especially male, especially white, especially able-bodied context, Walden quoted in Thinking Critical, of the original comics as something that should be challenged in order to tell a new story. YouTuber Thinking Critical had a few things to say about this decision to center the female body, stating, "The male characters aren't just decorations, in The Walking Dead. They are the emotional anchors to a lot of the stories." Later, further theorizing, "She wasn't just rejecting the setting, she was rejecting the audience that liked it in the first place. And remember, when a creator specifically says that they are moving beyond, what they are saying is they are moving on without you, the actual readers." This directly connects to Chute's idea of the risk of representation. In order for one group of people to be given the visibility they need, another group may attempt to censor it as a way to control the fact that they are no longer the intended audience. Or even further than that, they do not want the voice of that group to be heard by the masses, as it might inspire a kind of social change or understanding. In a YouTube video made by user Shook Earth Media, he believes that Clementine making the decision to go to Vermont was cowardly and she could never be unhappy with the life she created at the school. Even going as far as to say, "I don't know, I think Clementine just needed a love interest, which she had 2 of them in the last season. What about them?" I want to make it known that Clementine does have a love interest in this series, a girl named Rika, who the fandom has dubbed as Tilly Walden's self-insert character. The only similarity between the 2 women is that they both have long hair and glasses. Other than that, the similarities stop there. While Robert Kirkman is praised for writing what he knows, when Tilly Walden engages in feminist practices, a witch hunt is conducted. But what is the importance of a woman's voice on a woman's story? For all intents and purposes, I think the Walking Dead fandom often forgets that Clementine is a woman. On all of the research I did, with misogyny oozing out of every pore, not one comment was made on the fact that Clementine has a unique experience because of her girlhood. We embody what we know on the page. Chute argues, the embodiment inherent to comics in its process of production, in which the hand-drawn mark indexes the body of the maker, helps insubstantiate the form, whatever the genre is, as one that is deeply embodied on several different levels. One can note that the body or bodies on the page and also in the page, in its traces of its own production, that comics as a form always conspicuously carries. Connecting Chute's concept of political and embodied body with Hélène Cixous's idea of écriture féminine, we can see that Walden's narrative is not only a story of trauma, but also a political statement. She breaks the male-dominated narrative present in the world of The Walking Dead and expresses fluid, marginalized experiences, one that focuses on Clementine as a person, rather than Clementine as a survivor of the apocalypse. The Walking Dead started as a character study of how the end of the world changes people. The tagline on back of each issue reads, "We are the Walking Dead." This inherently implies that the characters are the ones the reader are supposed to focus on, rather than the events that are unfolding around them. One of the key aspects of the Telltale games is the element of choice. While playing Clementine, the player controls all of her decisions, what she says, how she responds, and her relationships with other non-player characters. This inherently means the player is projecting themselves onto Clementine and using her story to live out the events as if they were her in the situation. However, the comics take this element of choice away from the player and give it to Walden, who creates Clementine the way she interprets her as a character. Walden focuses heavily on the ways that Clementine's previous life experiences inform the decisions she makes on her journey. Following Cicé's vein of thinking, it is clear that Walden is writing the body rather than just writing a character. She reflects the ways that sensual, physical, and emotional experiences impact the way that someone interacts with everyday aspects of their life. As stated before in the game, there's a disconnect in that sense, as people are writing Clementine's stories themselves, and no two game experiences are 100% the same. There are always small deviations that impact the way the player interacts with Clementine. There's a distinct separation of the mind and of the body, as we, the player, are her mind, and the pixels on the screen are her body. However, in accordance with Écriture Féminine, Walden blends these concepts to create an embodied and flowing experience of life through Clementine's own mind and body. She is no longer a puppet, but the master of her own story. I think this is really where the issue of the comic lies. The fandom is so used to seeing Clementine act the way they want her to, that when their own sense of agency is removed from the equation, they find the closest person to blame. In this case, it is the author. Tillie Walden is a very qualified and talented creator. She remains on track to become a prominent name in the comic book industry. And remember, Robert Kirkman picked her to be the author of the series. She didn't swindle him or use crazy lesbian feminist powers to hypnotize him into giving her the IP. He picked her because he liked her previous work and thought she would be able to handle the task of expanding Clementine's story. Kirkman himself writes strong women. Over the course of the comic series, women are seen in positions of power and are depicted as strong, intelligent, and vital parts of the group they reside within. However, based on my research, this is the first bit of Walking Dead IP that is solely created by a woman. A few episodes of the show were written and produced by women, and women were on the development team for Telltale's The Walking Dead, but I think having a woman's name attached to the project, completely solo, colored the fandom's perspective of the comic before it was ever really given a chance. Who knows what people might have thought if it had been just written by a man. I really wanted to close off this video with a quote from Komsky Project's video on the original Walking Dead comics. He states, "The things we love may not have as much power as they once did, but they're always going to be there. What you get out of a piece of media, regardless of its quality, is more important than some objective critical standard that everyone must feel the same on, because frankly, that's boring, and if it is those individual perspectives that are infinitely more interesting." At the start of the video, I talked about how much of a superfan I was at 13 years old. I know that as a little girl, seeing someone as cool as Clementine in a comic book would have done wonders for my self-confidence. I might have fallen off the fandom wagon years ago, but seeing Walden tackle this subject matter was enlightening to me. The female experience is one that is so unique. I don't think anyone who wasn't socialized as a girl could fully understand that. This is why it is so valuable to have narratives that deal with the trauma of girlhood, regardless of whether or not we grew up in the apocalypse. Much like Shute and Cicé's concept of the writing and drawing of the body as paramount and political, it must be known that even if this process was traumatic for Walden, she managed to demonstrate the important message of survival that is ever present in a woman's life, and the thematic undercurrent of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead.